Hello, welcome to the Ethical Humanist Society. I'm Anil Kashyap, and I'm a member who will be moderating today. If you're new to us, I'm going to start by telling you a little bit about our group. We are a member of the American Humanist Association. Our programs address a wide variety of topics, including current events, philosophy, arts, sciences, and ethics, just to name a few. And today's presentation is part of our ongoing programming related to Chicago. To deliver it, we're delighted to have Carl Smith, who's the Franklin Bliss Snyder Professor of English and American Studies and Professor of History Emeritus at Northwestern, where he's author of 6 highly acclaimed books on Chicago, including The Plan of Chicago, Daniel Burnham and the Remaking of the American City, which was published in 2006. That book was awarded the Lewis Mumford Prize for Best Book in American Planning History by the Society for American City and Regional Planning History, and was chosen by the Chicago Public Library in the fall of 2009 as its selection for One Book, One Chicago, that program. In collaboration with academic and research technologies at Northwestern and the Chicago Historical Museum, he's the author and curator of 2 major online exhibits. One is The Great Chicago Fire and Web of Memory, and the Dramas of Haymarket. He's one of the founders of the program in American Studies at Northwestern, and he served as the director of that program multiple times. And in 1994, he was named the Charles Deering McCormick Professor of Teaching Excellence at Northwestern. Today, he's going to talk to us about his most recent book on Chicago's Great Fire. So join me in welcoming Carl, and we'll return for questions after he's completed. Thank you.
Thanks. I'm going to demask during this talk, but I want to thank Anil. I want to thank this organization. It's an organization which, in fact, I've studied to some degree. It's central to my mind as a cultural historian of America in this period to the late 19th century. And the whole question of what constitutes ethical and socially constructive action and varieties of faith. I particularly was interested in the work of William Salter, who was so fundamental to this organization here, and in relation to Haymarket. I'll get back to that before I'm done. But let's talk about the book. Chicago's Great Fire, the destruction and resurrection of an iconic American city, is a narrative, and remarkably, it's the first carefully researched and documented full treatment of both the destruction of the city and then the rebuilding. And it also talks about the place of the fire in the city's history. It includes about 70 illustrations and about 7 maps, and I'll show some of those to you today. It focuses mostly on events and people, key to understanding the fire and the rebuilding. And the place, as I've already said, the place of the fire in the Chicago's history. It's meant to be an exciting and engaging human story for general readers, a good read. It includes a very wide range of people, including rich and poor, men and women and children, immigrants and Yankees, including a lot of people that aren't usually included in such histories. It starts and ends with this woman, the story of Catherine and Patrick OLeary and their 5 children, 4 cows, a calf, and a horse, and her evolution from scapegoat to folk hero. She was innocent, repeatedly cleared, including in the official inquiry in the late fall of 1871, and most recently officially by unanimous city council in 1997. There's a chapter in the book on who started the fire. And it puts this all in its historical context. This is Norman Rockwell's 1935 painting. It was for a calendar. And he said it was the worst painting he ever did, not because it was a bad painting in itself, but who wants to look at the rear end of a cow for a whole year? The context includes the transformation of the United States. This is a map of the United States in 1870. Looking pretty much as it looks now, although many of the areas between the Mississippi and the mountain and the Pacific coastal states were at this point still territories. It includes the transformation of the United States by immigration, capitalism, westward movement, industrialization, the communications and transportation revolutions, and of course, urbanization, all of which were most fully embodied by the sudden rise of Chicago in the 4 decades before the fire, from this lonely outpost on the edge of the Great Lakes to a city of 330,000 people. That was a major nexus in an expanding national and international network. This period, by the way, is also the context for the rise of ethical humanism, founded in only 6 years after the fire, Felix Adler in New York in 1877. Again, I'll get back to that. The book has an overarching argument, and that's for all its remarkable achievement and justifiable boosterism. Chicago was a highly flammable society, socially as well as physically. In terms of social volatility, the fire and the rebuilding both revealed and intensified the considerable ethnic and class divisions in the city. Well, let's get into the actual story. Here's a map from the book of Chicago in 1871. It was about 1/6 of its current size. The northern border at Fullerton, the western one is now Pulaski. The southern one is now Pershing Road, about 39th Street. In 1840, 3 years after it was incorporated as a city, Chicago was still the 92nd biggest city in the United States, with 4,470 people. I like to put this in perspective by saying it was just behind Beverly, Massachusetts. By 1870, the national census, it was 300,000, the fourth or fifth biggest city in the United States, with 30,000 more by the time of the fire. But it was not a stable or unified city. It had virtually no past and no urban or other kind. It's, again, it's a sudden city created by the conditions of the 19th century. Had little focus on the present, since things would always be different tomorrow. It's fitting that this is the place where the commodities future market was devised. And everyone seemed to be from somewhere else because they were. And often that somewhere else was pretty far away. At the time of the fire, about 48% of the population, and this was a drop from earlier, had been born abroad in another country. About 1 in every 5 Chicagoans was born in what became Germany in the year of the fire, and more than 1 in 8 in Ireland, with smaller representations from Scandinavia and Bohemia, what we now call the Czech Republic. And if you count their children, people who had at least one immigrant child, that made up more than 70% of the Chicago population. About the remaining third or so, or 30% or so, most of it was from the states that made up the old Northwest, Illinois, Indiana, Minnesota, Wisconsin, and so on. But about 10% of the city as a whole, a third of these native-born people, were from mostly the Middle Atlantic and New England states, mostly upper New York and New England. And they controlled virtually all of the city's wealth. And the first generation people like William Ogden, who came from upstate New York, and the people arriving in the 1850s included people like George Pullman from western New York, and Potter Palmer from near Albany, and Marshall Field from central Massachusetts. There was a vital African-American community, but it constituted only about 1.2% of the population. African-Americans could vote only since 1870, and the public schools would not be integrated for a few years. Women, of course, could not vote at all for almost another half century, and one of the Chicagoans whose fire experience the book talks about is this woman, Myra Bradley, whom was published, whose husband was a lawyer and a judge. She was a friend of Mary Lincoln, and she edited a thing called the Chicago Legal News, but she wanted to be a lawyer. But the state of Illinois, in its wisdom, said that women could not be attorneys. And then the Supreme Court, 2 years after the fire, in the famous case of Bradwell versus Illinois, upheld the state of Illinois 8-1. She did not become qualified or allowed till 1890, a few years before her death. It's important to avoid talking about any of these groups as monoliths, as the Germans or the Irish, because there were considerable differences among them in many ways, including where they came from in the old country, such as it was. But as a general rule, immigrants and their children made up the vast majority of skilled and unskilled working people. And as a general rule, ethnicity, class, and religion correlated. In particular, it's very, very hard to overstate the overt anti-immigrant and especially anti-Irish Catholic prejudice of the Yankee population, the native-born population from, particularly from the Middle Atlantic and New England states and the upper Midwest. No such thing as political correctness, just this outright vilification of these dirty, drunk immigrants, lazy, in the daily papers, just taken as a given, the major papers, the Chicago Times, the Chicago Tribune. But things were changing. The native-born Yankee elite basically ran the city's politics up to the mid-century, including its weak mayoralty and its very strong unicameral legislative body, although urban government is pretty minimal in this period. But by 1871, immigrants or their kind constituted the majority of voters, close to 60%. And ethnic politicians, especially Irish ones, controlled similar percentage of the Common Council, as the unicameral body was called. It became the City Council in 1875 with a new charter. The wealthy native-born population was very unhappy with the situation and attacked the integrity of ethnic politicians, to some degree with justification, but nowhere to the extent that they attacked them, and they were not without fault themselves. And at the time of the fire, the story that was breaking nationally at this time was the exposure of the Tweed Ring in New York and corrupt politicians. And Chicago Yankees tried to frame the ethnic politicians here in terms of Tweed. Tweed, by the way, was a British Protestant, not in any case. And there were various cultural issues, and we talk now about abortion dividing people. At that point, the major issue was temperance, that the Irish and the German drink, and we don't, or we, even if we do, we're more temperate about it. And economically, this gets back to issues about class, a distrust of unions and union organization, a sense that we know better, we as the owners trust us, and late 1860s were a bad time for unions, but they were kind of regrouping. But a distrust for union labor leaders, saying that they interfered with the individual right, workers' right to negotiate the terms of labor. And the city was, as I've already said, physically flammable as well. A terrible fire trap. Much of it looked like this. 40,000 of the 60,000 buildings in the city were basically plain pine buildings. This happens to be the OLeary house, actually the OLeary houses. They owned on this 25 by 100-foot plot on the near southwest side, these two pine shanties. They lived in the rear one and rented the first to another Irish immigrant family, and the famous barn was to the north, to the right. But not only do you see how it's basically tinder, but also something throughout the whole city which made up tinder, these raised pine sidewalks and these picket fences, which were everywhere. And even some of the best brick and stone buildings in the downtown weren't a whole lot better. This is Randolph Street looking east, west of Clark Street. And you see what's there, wooden signs everywhere, wooden architectural elements such as the cornices, wooden roofs on many of these buildings, and signs of all kinds everywhere. This sign, by the way, advertises the Chicago equivalent of the Barnum Museum called Colonel Wood's Museum, which was the same kind of mix of strange and improbable things. Even the City Hall, which was located where the City Hall is now, the Cook County and building and the City Hall combined, and the block defined by Clark, Randolph, LaSalle, and Washington streets was basically a mess. It was poorly constructed, and the new wings were just added in 1869, the wooden cupola we see there. On the plus side, Chicago had a state-of-the-art fire department to a certain extent. It had all new or relatively new modern equipment, steam, not hand-pumped pumpers, and so on. It had a telegraph alarm system of 172 boxes that people could send in an alarm to a central area that would then alert fire department and so on. But it had many flaws in it. The main one being it was too small, and that it did not in any way keep up with the growth of the city. And about 200 active firefighters in the city of 330,000 people, made largely of wood. There were plenty of warnings from the fire department itself and papers like the Tribune, opposition from wealthy people in particular who paid most of the taxes, which were basically property taxes, that they just didn't want to pay it. Professor Kashyap could explain to us how people don't like to pay for things that might happen as opposed to other things. And there were several additional factors that made the city vulnerable to a large fire in the fall of 1871. The summer and fall were extremely dry in the upper Midwest, with hot days in early October as there were in this October. The temperature reaching into the 80s, winds from the southwest. There were 24 fires in the week before the big fire. Most importantly, a major fire the night before, on Saturday night, October 7th, 1871, the so-called Saturday Night Fire, which you see here. North is to the right. This is the area where Union Station is now. This fire, which consumed 4 full blocks in an area that was basically one of the most fire-prone areas, not only was full of factories that had piles of wood and piles of volatile chemicals in them, among other things. And this fire was rung about 10 or 11 o'clock on Saturday night, and it was not finally out till the afternoon. So the fire department fought all night, the night of October 7th and into the 8th, and with damage to the equipment and a good portion of the firefighters, already a small group, injured, or what should I say, put out of service, eyes closed from smoke and inhalation and so on. The final deadly factor that allowed Chicago to burn, in addition to all these other things that made a kind of perfect storm, was an inexplicable failure in that alarm system that delayed the arrival of the first crews by about half an hour, by which time, with the dry city, the depleted apartment, the wind from the southwest, the fire beginning in the near southwest side, the fire was basically out of control. Chicago burned for about 30 hours, from about 9 p.m. on Sunday, October 8th, to early in the morning of Tuesday, October 10th. Here you have a lithograph of it after the fact, a bird's eye view. Thanks to the southwest wind, the fire moved generally but not unvaryingly from the OLeary neighborhood, about a mile southwest of where the city hall, a little bit more of the city hall and county building were, leaked the south branch of the Chicago River, burned the entire downtown. The wind just blew it into there, and then left the main branch of the river and burned most of the north side as well. This was helped by the fact of because of the wind and also these strong updrafts that threw chunks of burning Chicago into the air. So they thrown into the air and then the wind would blow them. So it was no problem to leap the south branch of the river or then the main branch, including more or less at the same time. So it's really not one fire, but multiple fires. And here's a map from the Encyclopedia of Chicago. What you see in the purple area in the southwest there, Sunday night, there's the Saturday night fire area, which was then through much of Sunday night, burning through much of the downtown, which is still there now, and into the north side over here, the near north as we now know it. Then Monday during the day, much of this area. Farther north here, this area in the southwest that we now know is the beginnings of Streeterville, and then back down through the downtown, finally burning out late afternoon around where the auditorium building is in the late afternoon on Monday, and then Monday evening burning up to Fullerton, the northern border of the city, ending early Tuesday morning. It was an extraordinary fire. The main body of the fire, the different parts would gather and split off and go in different directions, was as much as a half a mile wide, leveling all those wooden buildings as if they were paper, melting glass, twisting iron. That requires a temperature of 2,800 degrees Fahrenheit, and reducing stone to powder. A terrifying experience. And the book integrates all kinds of personal accounts of the chaos in the streets. This is downtown, people grabbing their parents, their children, their valuables, trying to escape on foot, on wagons, whatever else, a crazy attempt to get out. You see things, they went basically where they could go. They went north, since the fire was coming from the south, east to the lake on the south, on the north side, west where they could, above the fire in the Western Division, and north trying to outrun the fire. Whoops, sorry. Here is a part of the flight west across the Randolph Street Bridge, which did not burn. All the bridges across the river to the north burned, although there was a brand new LaSalle Street tunnel that remained a major escape site. But we're looking east toward the lake, and we see these people escaping over the Randolph Street Bridge, which did not burn. Some going north, trying to find a place that would not burn. One of the places they found first was the city cemetery, which was in what we now know as Lincoln Park. Lincoln Park started in the mid 1860s, but it really at this point was only about a half a mile wide, looking vertically, starting around Wisconsin Street. And the city cemetery was from North Avenue up to there. At this point, for health reasons, bodies were being moved out, but that's a kind of another story. But at this point, it was still the city cemetery, and people thinking this is a place that won't burn. But you see people fleeing the city here, going through the Potter's Field. You see both the graves and the things that have been abandoned and the need to escape. And you see the mix of people. It's hard to exaggerate the damage. This is a map of the so-called burnt district, which was a fire, and each of those loops we see as another mile. The fire burned an area about 4 miles long and about 2/3 of a mile wide. And again, north is to the right. The lake is below us, right in front. Is the east. It burned 122 miles of those wooden sidewalks. It burned about $200 million in property value in a city whose property value was given as about $600 million, about a third of the property. It burned 18,000 of those 60,000 buildings, including the most valuable ones, the ones in the downtown, both residential and commercial and wholesale. The north side lost something like 13,300 of its 13,800 buildings. I mean, obviously the hardest hit. 3 of the 4 downtown railroad depots, 1,600 stores, 28 hotels, 60 factories, about a quarter of the city's 165 churches, and all the stuff in these places. People grabbed what they could of sentimental or financial value, but a lot of that they had to abandon, and their children and themselves, and ran, and stores and their inventories burning up. About 90,000 or more people, it's hard to get exact figures, were left homeless, more without jobs because their places of work were gone. To put this in perspective again with other cities, this is about the same as the entire population of Cleveland at the time of the fire. And Cleveland was the 15th biggest city in the country. The devastated city was a unnerving wasteland. There's some amazing pictures in the Chicago Cultural Center of blow-ups of the whole, basically the downtown of high resolution made from the negatives at the time. Here's the the Van Buren Street Bridge with this single figure. The bridges were mostly wood, and they rotated, and virtually all of them burned, the downtown ones. This was taken by George N. Barnard, who was a professional photographer, just moved to Chicago, but through the 60s, he, among other things, he followed the Union Army. He took pictures of the ruins of Atlanta after Sherman was there. So he was well qualified to do this kind of thing. Here's a slide of that City Hall and County building. Look through another ruin. It looks better than it was. It was basically entirely hollowed out. The city was and here is the picture that's on the cover of my book. This is State and Madison. A few days after the fire, the streetcars were back running for half price, and the rubble is starting to collect the rubble, and including recycling some bricks, the ones that can be reused. Much of this rubble pushed into the lake. At this point, there was a kind of lagoon at the lakefront. The lake came virtually up to Michigan Avenue, and then out in the lake a few hundred yards were the Illinois Central tracks. So there was a kind of lagoon, and the rubble was pushed into that, and that lagoon was gone in a few months. This is the beginnings of Grant and Millennium Park. It's based on fire fill in significant part. But the city was the beneficiary of an extraordinary outpouring of help from outside, one of the great affirmative stories of the fire. Because Chicago was at this transportation and communication nexus, it became what I like to call the first instantaneous news event, international news event, because the transatlantic cable was successfully completed in 1866. That is to say, people far away knew about it while it was happening in real time, and with new, larger, and this is the whole story of publication with steam-driven presses and pulp paper and railroads. The story is out there. It goes viral almost immediately in a sense that's completely modern and innovative. So in the papers, and the Chicago is still burning Monday morning and will burn for another 12 hours, 18 hours more. People are reading about it in New York and Boston and other places. And by Tuesday morning, they're reading about it in London and Paris and other places. And while the city is still burning, there's a spontaneous outflow of aid. Chicago's already on the map. This is the place where the provisions come from. This is the phenomenon of the 19th century. They need our help. Part of this is in the context of remembering the Civil War as well, and its importance in relation to that. So 3 o'clock on Monday afternoon, Cleveland is organizing a rally. This is also in response to just before he abandoned the city hall, the mayor of Chicago sent out telegrams for help. And as soon as 3 in the morning, fire engines loaded on trains were arriving in the city. They weren't of much use, but there they were. And then these meetings were held, raising money and goods, and they're put on trains to be sent to Chicago. And that in turn becomes part of the story. In Faneuil Hall in Boston, also on that Monday afternoon, people are talking. Here we see the ethically challenged financier Jim Fisk, the swindler of the Erie Railroad, sort of cleaning his name up a little bit by raising money raising goods for the Chicago sufferers. That's those ERERS words there, and then loading it on an Erie Railroad train to be shipped to Chicago, and so on. This total, and this stuff came from everywhere over the next few months, from Japan and Prussia, from millionaires and children, and so on, everywhere. And the total given is the equivalent in rough equivalent in The 2021 dollars are about $200 million in aid. It becomes also the story, and this is, I think, and frame it in terms of the reason organizations like this one grow out. What is the meaning we take away from this? And the Sunday after the fire, about a week after it was out, it's the sermon in every church is, what do we make of this? And there are some ministers are talking still fire and brimstone. This is Sodom and Gomorrah all over again. You're being punished. But the most popular clergyman in America, one of the most popular people in America, the Congregationalist minister, Henry Ward Beecher, the younger brother of Harriet Beecher Stowe, at the Plymouth Church in Brooklyn, gives a thing on the meaning of the fire, taking as his text from Psalm 36, "Thy judgments are a great deep." What do we take from this? And we see in here evolving Christianity in this period, from sin and sin and punishment to a larger thing. And he takes as his text basically the aid that it brought out. The fire brought out the best in people and humanized us all and showed how we're all connected. He ended with a kind of great double negative. We could not have not done with the Chicago fire, a sense that it was a thing for us all. More hard-headed people said, no, we got to build a city. We could have done without the fire, and we can't afford it again. We've got to build a more fireproof city. They run into a lot of opposition, as I'll explain in a bit. Partly because people are eager to rebuild. The winter is coming, and let's just slap up what we can. The rebuilding starts almost immediately, and newspapers are publishing by the Wednesday after the fire. Water service is restored. Schools are reopened, not on the same basis, but they're reopened. And we see the signs of Chicago reasserting itself after the thing. Suitably, a real estate man named William D. Kerfoot, who had an office on Washington Street, very near where the city hall was, slapped up this on his property, slapped up this shack and say, I'm back in business. And actually within 2 weeks of the fire, a major land transfer was made. This was very difficult because, among other things, all property records were burned in the fire. That's a whole other kind of story. But anyway, and on that shack was this sign, which is now in the History Museum. William D. Kerfoot is at 59 Union Park. That's his residence. All gone but wife, children, and energy. Chicago reasserting itself. And we see things like this. This is on the east side of Michigan Avenue, which you can see even at this time, like much of the city, is unpaved. But this is Michigan Avenue near around where Randolph, well, where Grant Park is now. Temporary leases given to put up these buildings on the east side, but the lake is right behind them. You see the burned out trees and so on here. But these are not fireproof buildings, of course, in any way. The first winter, most of the building is commercial stuff, and including some more substantial brick buildings. It's hard to do to get buildings to set in the cold and rainy Chicago winter, and there's a lot of hurry, a lot of buildings that fail, and a lot of people that get hurt, but they go up. And in the second, more residential, here we see the Marine Bank going up at Lake and LaSalle. What we see here is the use of derricks among the various kinds of innovations to build quickly, using arc light to build at night, trying to build fires to keep the mortar warm and things like that. But for a while, most businesses found their place either in unburned places in the near west side or in what we now call the South Loop, often in what were residential buildings before. So you have a building in which where a bedroom was now where a cobbler or a lawyer, and downstairs was a bank or something like that. Marshall Fields rented an old railroad barn, street railroad barn at 20th and State Street, and opened for business. But things got going. Here, basically, the city was largely rebuilt within 2 years. This is the new downtown in 1873. Again, north is to the right. There are larger buildings than were there before. It's not completely filled up, you see, by any means, but this area is about 45 square blocks, while before the fire it was around 25. New and bigger city is growing. The kind of buildings that went up were not, as many people think, skyscrapers. The skyscraper revolution is not till the mid-1880s. And the buildings that went up were not a whole lot different looking than the ones before the fire. Maybe a floor or two higher in many cases, but still buildings like this. Most of these are now gone, but here downtown, the Washington block at Washington Street by the L, a 4-story and plus a partly submerged basement sandstone building. These kinds of buildings are the ones that appear after. And this is what Chicago looks like. The area destroyed by the fire is just a fraction of the city. Much of this area, by the way, is not built on at all still at this point. But it's such a key area, including the whole downtown. And you see what it looks like there. And in the fall of 1871, the city decides to celebrate its recovery. And it has a big trade fair called the Interstate Exposition. And this 3-story building designed by W.W. Worthington, I don't think I have the name right, is centered on the east side of Michigan Avenue at Adams Street. This lasted for about 20 years and held a lot of other events in it, but was replaced in the early 1890s, Boynton, not Worthington, by the Art Institute of Chicago's first building, which is on this exact site. The recovery was celebrated even more at the World's Fair of 1893, by which time Chicago was the second biggest city in the United States. 1 million people and growing fast, some saying would surpass New York. And the emblem of Chicago was the I Will woman, this Amazon with a phoenix. Chicago as the phoenix city nesting in her hair, about to take flight, and the slogan, I will, on her breastplate here. The lesson taken from the fire is that the lesson taken from the destruction of Chicago is that Chicago is indestructible. Chicago is one of the very few places that celebrates its destruction because of its proof that it's indestructible. The city would have kept going. Let me just show you finish this out a little bit more here. Here's at the World's Fair, by far the most well-attended day was Chicago Day, picked to be October 9th, the anniversary of the fire, with great parades and fireworks and so on. And you see the I Will woman over here with the even broader winged phoenix coming out of her helmet here, her crown. I'm getting ahead of myself here. The rebuilding was hardly smooth or simple or unanimous. The social flammability comes up here. Problems that in part ethical humanists were joined together to try to address. It caused a deep concern among the Yankee elite, who, to give them credit, had done much to build the city in which they had prospered, but they felt that the inherently destabilizing nature of such a terrible event would create the opportunity for this underclass, which made up to their mind most of the city, to cause terrible damage and seize control. This is directly rooted in the city's already divided nature, mutual suspicion. It's in this context that the story of Mrs. OLeary and her cow emerges, about these dangerous people among us. I don't want to talk about that at length. The book gets at it, and I don't want to get hung up in here. But this is all this in spite of the fact that poorer Chicagoans, as is part of the timeless pattern of disasters, suffered disproportionately from the fire and had fewer recovery resources of every kind. Less insurance, less credit, no network of influential and wealthy people. And this, of course, included the OLearys. In this context, this Yankee elite that I've talked about staged a kind of multi-part coup in the days following the fire by convincing the mayor of Chicago to do two things and then to take action on another thing themselves. The mayor was a weak figure, but in this time he had certain powers of appointment here that he took advantage of here. The key of these people is that they did build up a city in many ways, but they were unable to distinguish their interests from the city's interests. The sense that what's good for us is good for everybody, and that these people, the working people, which they know they must have, need to be controlled and managed. They get the mayor, Roswell Mason, to appoint this man on October 11th, the Civil War hero Philip Sheridan, as protector of peace and safety. He is in Chicago not as a civilian, but as a military officer directing the troops that are at this point settling the area between the Mississippi and the Rockies. It's another name for saying fighting Indians. And they get him to take charge of a kind of makeshift thing of both soldiers and volunteers and citizens, a kind of very illegal and irregular martial law. And Chicago is for several days guarded by these people. This is a drawing on the scene of you had to give a password to get around and so on. This is particularly in the central downtown. The larger step in the coup, but this ended within about 2 weeks. It sort of fell apart when an untrained University of Chicago undergraduate volunteer killed the city district attorney. But that's, again, another story. The larger coup was seizing control of all that aid that had been sent to the city. That had been sent to the people of Chicago, the city of Chicago. But they talked the mayor into saying the city council shouldn't get it, the common council shouldn't get it, but an organization they led, a small charity called the Relief and Aid Society, to have total control of this. And they got it. And basically, they did a magnificent job in many ways, serving without pay, endless hours, doing all kinds of things. But the key agenda was, we don't trust them, and we want to rebuild the city as it was, with us in charge, with them working as we want. So they did things like link aid to work. We see this coming out in many ways now, but also saying that if you don't take a job that we tell you to take, we'll cut off the aid to your family. They did not have German-speaking people. They said if anybody asked for aid, they were by definition suspicious, and they had to provide letters of recommendation from people we trust, and we have to visit them. And meanwhile, and fill out forms, and a lot of people couldn't write. All kinds of things, but basically to get things back in their way. We see, again, debates now about don't give out aid. It'll discourage people from getting back to work. And meanwhile, giving aid, seeking out people from among themselves, saying they were too proud to ask, so we have to go find them and give them aid in various ways. Basically, though, under it, a no trust in urban democracy. We cannot trust the people who voters elected to distribute the aid. We're going to do it. And the third part of the coup is, here's some of the distribution of aid, where we see well-dressed women giving out the aid. The election of this man, Joseph Medill, at this point a part owner of the Chicago Tribune. He wouldn't be the longtime editor until 1874, but getting him elected mayor in the election already scheduled for a month after the fire in early November, on the so-called fireproof ticket that was supposedly independent of the party that had the best men running in various ways. And again, to trust us, put us in charge, we'll take care of you. This all raised problems along those lines that I talked about already. Objections that Sheridan was protecting the rich from the poor, and not when the poor were the ones who needed help. In terms of the Relief and Aid Society, discrimination against the poor and the foreign-born, and discrimination by Medill against working people. He was fine with raising rents because of on the laws of supply and demand, but he was not good on But he said wanted workers to not raise their wages. That's the way to be patriotic. Don't raise your wages. Build a better Chicago, and things will be better. It's a kind of magical thinking, which in the face of strikes or threats of strikes, he didn't even last out his term. He was so frustrated with his inability to do things, he resigned in August of 1873. And by that time, a coalition, unprecedented and not to be repeated, of Irish and German elected their mayor as part of this ongoing tension between groups along different lines. One of the key fights was over what were called fire limits, which are basically zoning laws where you could build with fireproof materials. And Medill wanted to say nowhere could you build with wood. And working people said that's all well and good, except for the fact that we can't afford to build with brick or stone. So this culminated in a city council meeting, an event very much like January 6th, where working people, but a lot of hooligans coming along, marching on a city common council meeting, and it turning into a wild melee. In any case, only a limited ordinance was passed, and that was not enforced. Chicago did not become fireproof in any particular way, or even aggressive on fire prevention until well into the 20th century. There was a major fire in the summer of 1874 in what we call the South Loop. Again, things that almost a repeat of what happened before. But there's a bad feeling along class and ethnic lines that comes out of the fire. Separate views of who the people are and who should determine its future. And I told you about that election of 1873. In many ways, the real test for the city was not the fire, but the panic of 1873, one of the terrible depressions in the city's history, and the national economy was all up and down through the late 19th century. Even though the city celebrated its recovery in the fall of 1873, already the signs were in terrible shape. There was basically a contraction of money to be lended, largely through the failure of railroads, but then triggering into other companies as well, and terrible unemployment, strikes and demonstrations of different kinds. Including demonstrators. This is the march on the temporary city hall, which is where the Rookery building is now. But in late 1873, early 1874, demonstrations outside the Chicago Relief and Aid Society saying, you still have money, just give it to us. We're starving. Signs that say bread or death. And them saying, fill out the forms, get the thing, so on. Still the sense that it's our money, not your money, even though it was given to you, and we know what's best. So the heritage of the fire goes in a few different directions. And I like to talk about it in relation to these two men. The man on the left is Louis Sullivan. The man on the right is Albert Parsons. Louis Sullivan was a teenage prodigy of sorts in architecture, working for a Philadelphia firm. And in the fall of 1873, he lost his job because of the Depression. And he got on a train in Philadelphia and came to Chicago and said, this is the place for me. And he found other people like fine spirits, found work and so on. And by the 1880s was an established architect and so on. We know that story. The man on the right is Albert Parsons, who was born in the South, but could trace his ancestry back to the 17th century New England. And he volunteered for the Confederate Army when he was like 13 years old. But after the war, he became much more, what can I say, socially aware, much more woke, let's put it. He married an African-American woman, tried to support Reconstruction. That was not a non-starter in this period for a lot of people. And so he moved to Philadelphia. He was a printer by trade. He had his wife come join him in Philadelphia. So at virtually the same time, he gets on a train from Philadelphia, like Sullivan, and comes to Chicago. He immediately becomes radicalized, joins a union, but becomes radicalized by things like that demonstration with the relief outside the Relief and Aid Society. and becomes more and more radicalized through the railroad strike of 1877, the up and down economy of the 1880s. And so they end in very different ways. Sullivan, by the late 1880s, has designed the auditorium building. Parsons is a speaker in 1886 at the rally in the Haymarket Square that leads to the Haymarket bombing, and he is a year later hanged with 3 other men on the scaffold. The point here is that the story of triumph, rebuilding, is absolutely as remarkable as the destruction. And Chicago's indestructibility is in many ways a fact, but it's hardly the whole story. But these stories are never the whole story, and they're always part of the larger issues of their time, which are not resolved. And it's again in this thing, I think, that organizations like this one come up with, how do we solve the issue? What way do we do it? Do we do it by building Fort Sheridan and armories in the city on one hand, or we do it by building Hull House on the other, and try to how do we hold society together? How do we make it work? This is the period of lots of utopian literature of people like books like Looking Backward and William Demetrius Lloyd, Wealth Against Commonwealth, and Henry George, and the searches for solutions, ways to grasp the nature of society physically and socially and intellectually, the building of Pullman and others. But it's a rough time, a difficult time, full of triumphs and full of, what can I say, agitation and difficulty, and people trying to figure it out. Thank you.
All right, we're going to have a brief musical interlude. You can collect your thoughts. We're going to also collect contributions. If you're watching on the YouTube, you can send a donation to the address that's broadcast there. If you're in the auditorium here, you can scan the QR code. There's a basket in the back of the room where you can also deposit some money. We suggest a donation of $5, but that's neither a ceiling nor a floor, and we appreciate anything you can spare. And we're grateful for all who sustain the society with their donations of time and money. So we'll be back in a minute or two to take questions. And if you're online, you can start sending your questions in the chat box. and if you've got a question in the auditorium, feel free to come up here. I'm going to start with one that you exonerated Mrs. OLeary. Who was the actual person or factors that were responsible for the beginning of the fire?
I'm going to say that question's irrelevant and then answer it.
Okay.
The point about that fire, and no one ever, what can I say? It was just, fires happen. So the real question is, how could such a fire burn down a city? And I tried to explain that. There are, again, now trying to answer your question, we're pretty sure it did start in the barn, but we're virtually positive she was in bed with her children by that time, that she milked the cows hours before. And there are stories about a neighbor. There are stories, a man named Richard Bales, and did wonderful stuff by looking at the title, what can I say, property records and the transcript. And he sort of pins it on a neighbor named Daniel Sullivan, who reported, the first man to report the fire and roused the OLearys that he was probably just smoking and he started the fire. There are then stories of all kinds. One thing that things like this always generate, as we know, is rumors. And that combined with the fact that we want to know why, especially we want to know why bad things happen. And we want to we want someone to blame. And we also at the same time want we don't want it to be too scary. So the others that were involved included a scary one, saying this was an extension of the Paris Commune of the spring. This was terrorism. And others that this was or arson. Mrs. OLeary made a perfect scapegoat. There's the physical proximity, but also because she didn't jar ideas about the way things are. She confirmed them, that this was a clumsy, stupid, Irish immigrant Catholic woman, and this is what you get. So you gotta, and the lesson is we gotta monitor these people. And meanwhile, the real reason, again, is not why the fire started. Fires start. And so the question is, what do you do about it? And so you practice fire prevention. So what really set the Chicago fire was building this city so rapidly, so sloppily out of wood, and then and having a too small fire department, things that were in control, and then some bad luck. And so the argument here, and this gets again back to these fire and brimstone ministers versus someone like Beecher. And it's interesting. None of them ever mentioned Mrs. OLeary. One says it's a city of sin and being struck down. The other says God works in mysterious ways, but the lesson we take about is how humans rally to each other's aid. That's so that, again, they fit it into things they already believe. The scary thing is when things don't fit into what you already believe, and the thing that people don't want to say is you've got to build safer houses, you've got to have a bigger fire department, and Chicago resisted that very strongly. And it was finally after that, around the time of the fire in 1874, that it was insurance companies that said, we're not going to write insurance if you don't fix the things up. And they did, but even then, only poorly. Laws get passed, but they're not enforced, and so on. So it's a fight. And this gets into larger things, saying in many ways, we don't want to pay for it.
Okay, this follows closely with what you were just talking about. There's a question from the YouTube that says, could you remind us what the push factors were for the Irish and Germans that brought immigrants to Chicago? And was there a rival destination besides Chicago to which those groups were also going?
Yes. The people move from one place to another because they think life will be better in the other place. And that is in many cases not because they think life is terrible, but they think it's better elsewhere. And this is where to the entrepreneurs who come, and they come in stages, the fields or whatever, that this is where the future is, this is where opportunity is, this is where the economy is going, quite literally. But the European immigrants, it's a much bigger lift, as it were. And usually it's some mix of political or economic. It is impossible to separate large-scale Irish immigration from the famine in the 1840s, where it's unbelievable. A lot of Germans in Chicago are so-called 48ers who participated in the democratic revolutions of 1848 that failed and came over. But it's the reason anybody does anything. They think, most people do ever move. It's because they think life will be better. And it's a gamble. It's speculative. They invest their lives, their children, as well as their money in this place. But the sense that Chicago is where the future is happening. And if you go there, things will be better.
Thanks for your really interesting talk. My question is, were there other fires around the same time in other cities of a similar magnitude? And if so, can you compare and contrast those?
The 19th century is full of fire. These rapidly built cities made largely of wood. So Chicago is it's an extreme example, but it's hardly the only one. Major ones in New York in 1835 and 45. The biggest one, I think, up before the Great Chicago Fire was the Portland, one we never hear about, the Portland, Maine fire of 1866. The Chicago Fire is in its own, or what can I say, in the big leagues. The Chicago Fire is on the same scale, and again, different times, different places, as things like the London Fire of 1666, the Moscow Fire of 1812, and looking ahead, the San Francisco, the fires that followed the earthquake in 1906. But there's a great Jacksonville fire, a great this fire, a great that fire. It's sort of everywhere. And again, urban fire prevention is a 20th century phenomenon, the end of these large things. There's a great Boston fire a year after the Chicago Fire, a year and a month. And there's a rally in Chicago to send money to Boston. And there's a little bit of, what can I say, going on in that when they say, that all those people that said we burned because we were morally corrupt, what does this tell us now? This exemplar of Eastern rectitude burns down. But so it's funny. And the other related story here in relation to cultural development is that the same night as the Chicago Fire, exact same night, was the worst fire in terms of loss of life of any fire, just straight fire in American history, the Peshtigo, Wisconsin fire, 250 miles to the north near Green Bay, where basically pine timberland for building places like Chicago just went poof in a night, and people caught by surprise, and something like, the figures vary, but as many as 1,500 people killed in that night. But less famous because they're not on the grid in the same way. It gets reported, and even reported as worse than Chicago. But Chicago is the spotlight. It's when Chicago burns, it's the future is burning. And we're all involved in it. Yes.
I have several questions, but I'll only give you two. There are stories about the Palmer House being sold during the fire, and I wonder if you're familiar with that story. Also, there was I think a famous real estate agent who bought all sorts of property very, very cheap right after the fire and made thousands, if not millions. I wonder if those stories are accurate.
The first one is accurate, but not in relation to the Palmer House. The Palmer House was now the second Palmer House, and it was just about done and open, and it burned down. But the story there is that the architect buried the plans in clay, wet clay, and they survived the fire. And supposedly this is related to the finding out that terracotta is a great thing for preventing fire. And a lot of post-fire buildings are covered in terracotta. But the story you're talking about is the Tremont House Hotel, a legendary hotel in Chicago that burned, a place where Lincoln and Douglas spoke and Douglas died and so on. But the owner of that, a man named Drake, supposedly, while the city was burning, made a deal with the Michigan Avenue Hotel, a hotel that's sort of near where the auditorium is, and said, I'll buy it. It's basically a gamble that I don't think it'll burn, while the owner says, I think it will. And so they make a deal, and then it didn't burn. And then as the story goes, the owner had seller's remorse and said, no, we're not going to do it. And supposedly Drake brought some people to help convince the owner that the deal was good. And then he ran there for a while, something called the New Tremont Hotel, until the old Tremont Hotel was rebuilt. So that's that story. But Palmer House gets rebuilt in the 1870s. The most famous one in many ways, it's the version before the one we have now, the one with the barbershop with silver dollars in the floor and cuspidors everywhere and everywhere. I'm sure I can't name a particular person that fits that other story. The key here is that Chicago property basically held its value. At the time of the fire, when that first big sale in the downtown area of nothing but rubble, it wasn't as high a price as it had been bought for right before the fire, but it still was pretty high, and the prices kept up. But things go like this, and people get caught too. A number of people buy after the fire, but at this point, money is very expensive, and they're paying as much as 10% to borrow the money, and then the panic hits, and they are of 1873, and then to get back to phrases that we know from the bubble, they're underwater. They can't sell the land, they can't pay the loan, and they're ruined. So there's all kinds of stories, but by and large, the real estate kept its value. The interesting story at this time in terms of real estate is really the shift in the use of it. That already Chicago was changing this way, but it changed even more. That is to say, people and factories are moving out of the downtown. Churches had already moved for the most part to areas, and what we now know as the downtown is becoming more white collar and more differentiated by type of business. And because of the streetcars and railroads, the suburbs are also and further out. So people are moving farther out, and the downtown is becoming more business-like or to business. And so areas, I think a lot of the land booms and stuff are a lot of the deals are farther out as well as just downtown.
Okay, so we got a couple that are closely related to that. The first one is, did the fire accelerate the growth of Chicago, or did it just continue on the trend that it was on? And maybe the rebuilding.
I think at large, and the main thing is it didn't change it whole much. The arc of development was pretty similar, and the kind of standard view is that it didn't change the direction of Chicago, but it did in fact accelerate certain developments, largely, especially in terms of real estate, in terms of clearing out bad buildings that were still profitable. So there was a disincentive to get rid of them, and now suddenly they're gone. It was a terrible slum, but a profitable one. So southwest of our city hall, that was called Conley's Patch, and that just went up like in smoke. And that's where, in that area around there, is where the new large wholesale houses of Field and Farwell and others were built.
I've heard on, when you take the architectural tour on the river, one of the things that people talk about is the fact that because of the fire, there was all these opportunities to rebuild, and that partly a lot of the great architects of the day fled in to say, okay, I want to put my marker down here and then build something. And then that really then sets the stage for all the development along that river that comes ever since. Is that basically do you sign off on that story?
No. I think, first of all, people, I should say, yes, in a very qualified way.
Okay.
I think, yes, there was work in Chicago, but again, but established architects don't, just suddenly move in the same way. As I said, I think in some ways the bigger push, so they're getting commissions, both local and ones, but some of the same ones are working, and both locally and before, and some new ones do come and things change a little bit, but not in some, I think, revolutionary way that is sometimes said, and I tried to explain. It's not the skyscrapers all of a sudden just pop up. And I think maybe, and just as important a push is the panic of 1873, to the extent that there's work anywhere, it's in Chicago, and new work of different kinds and opportunities. So it's a kind of wishy-washy answer, but I don't have, I can't say there's some magic change that the fire works in that sense, or wholesale transformation.
Okay. How was the political dominance of the Yankees finally broken in Chicago? When does their grip loosen?
Well, the elections at that point are held every 2 years. And in fact, they're held every year. And the aldermen serve 1 year in a kind of, so there are two from each ward. So one seat is up 1 year and then the other seat and so on. It's still for a longer, for a while, as I say, they do the same dance. It is largely people from this Yankee elite who are elected mayor, and a city council that is viewed as corrupt and so on, and it's a kind of standoff. When it finally breaks, I mean, I should be able to answer this question, but it's never that simple, because it moves back in various ways, and corruption finds homes in different ways. Supposedly that's the Democrats are the corrupt ethnics, but in the time of Big Bill, what's his name, Thompson, he's a Republican, and what can I say, a Yankee, as far as I know. Maybe I'm wrong there. He does promise that to appeal to Irish voters, that he's going to, if the Prince of Wales come, he'd punch him in the nose. But I think it's more managing blocks and shifting coalitions that we still see to this day, and also the difficulty that we see to this day of, what can I say, groups on the outs aligning with each other. They suspect each other. So, what can I say, the dailies are operating with what basically a Yankee elite still, and where power is and how it comes and so on is tricky. And then obviously it gets changed by the politics of race. So it's the first immigrant mayor is not till what's his name, Cermak, it's the 30s. So anyway.
It sounds like you've come across some of the history of this organization. Is there anything that struck you that you like to report? I mean, we've periodically had reports on our history. We started in 1882, as you were mentioning, and we were, I think, second outpost after New York.
New York and Adler.
Yes.
And here's Salter.
Yeah.
Well, as a cultural and intellectual historian, first of all, I'm obviously very sympathetic to groups like this. I mean, people are saying in all kinds of ways that come in the Civil War is over, and we get all kinds of increasing conflicts, and as I mentioned, things like we're building armories in the cities, and we built Fort Sheridan. Fort Sheridan is built to guard against internal insurrection. That means basically workers. And when the Pullman strike takes place and federal troops are brought in to break the strike, it's a kind of remarkable cultural transition. Some of those troops have been up to this point fighting Indians, and that ends basically with Wounded Knee in 1890. And now the battlefield is the city and industrial capitalism, the future of it. So I think a lot of different people are trying to figure out what is the solution to the problem. And as I said, the most rigid wing is the kind of exterminate the brutes. It's build armories, build the fort, the iron heel, to push them down, break them. That this is the way the world works, and be happy with it. There are variations on that to make capitalism, more humane, and the building of the town of Pullman, which starts in the early 1880s. That's a way to live, a whole community. The problem there is that there's no democracy in Pullman. It's only George Pullman decides how things go, and he separates the business from the living in his head in ways that turn out not to be very well. And then there are these different plans of how we reorganize society. Henry George almost gets elected mayor of New York, and the most popular book in the 1880s is Looking Backward. This idea of a kind of socialist state, the army, industrial army. And again, Jane Addams moves into Hull House in 1889 and says the social fabric has broken down. Let's get middle-class people back with working people and these immigrants, and let them understand each other in some way. And how can we tell working people know that their lives have value, and we need them as much as they need us. And I think there are developments in religion that basically say, unless we deal with this, we're irrelevant. And there are people who say, in many ways, it is the what is it, deed, not creed. That and let's not talk about whether God is a Trinity or whatever else, or whether Moses was given the law, or the Jews are the chosen people, or whatever, or who has the right. But how? What can I say? That religion becomes, ethics and religion become. And if you read, books of this period, the Upton Sinclair's The Jungle. I mean, what basically he has a religious conversion. He falls asleep while a person is giving a speech, but the person is speaking is socialism, and basically what he's saying, socialism is Christ's law applied to society. So don't worry about Christ, worry about, society. And that should be and I think my own feeling is the sense in people like Adler, like Salter, that these forms are not doing it for me. And that you have to move the center from not what Christianity teaches me to what are the teachings that I should follow. And don't worry about whether you think God, Mary conceived Jesus and he's risen and all that stuff, or any other thing like that. But worry about saving this, humane life. Adler came out of a sense of someone like Emerson with Congregationalism, and he said that it's corpse cold, that Reformed Judaism just wasn't working for him. And Salter, I'm not sure how he came at it exactly. Anyway.
Okay, I think this is going to be our last one. You've debunked a bunch of things. I'm wondering, in the course of doing the research for this book, what do you think is the most misunderstood aspect of the fire? So we'll toss out OLeary, but in terms of just things that are underappreciated.
I think it's my central argument, a sense that a new city, was reborn Phoenix-like, and it was safer. It was suddenly more beautiful. It was, that it becomes. We had this 40-year prehistory. It almost gets dissolved, and the real birth is out of this fire that we were tested, and we passed the test, and a great new city leads to the future. And my main argument against that is, as I said, I think the fire both revealed and in many ways deepened some of the divisions that were there before. And I think that's the kind of central thing, and to understand that as well, without discounting the astonishing recovery. But the recovery, and I'm not the first one who said this by any means, is due, while in some significant part, to whatever, the grit, the courage, the resilience of the people of Chicago. It's due to the nature of the developing national and international, what we now call globalism at this point. That the world, Chicago was built with Eastern and European money because it served the developing national and international economy, and then it was rebuilt with the same thing because it was a good investment. This was where, and that, yes, on the scene were people who were very capable managers, but they're basically, the history was on Chicago's side at the time of the fire. And and you think by contrast, the contrast I'd like to bring up sometimes is history wasn't on New Orleans' side in 2005. So Chicago springs up, but New Orleans, it's much, much harder. And that is, much larger thing about how societies develop and so on.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.